Well, welcome to part 3 of the confirmation discussion of the Bible. Today we're going to talk about the Greek Bible, or the New Testament. We call it the Greek Bible because it was written in Greek. Now, this was the language of the Roman Empire, especially in the East, at the time of Christ, and so it is just natural that it would be communicated in the language that most people were able to understand. It is also written in Koine Greek, which is a very specific, average Joe kind of Greek. The point was that everybody should have access to this document, this set of documents, so that people could understand it and make sense out of it, because it's the foundational documents for the Christian tradition. All right, so what's inside of it? Well, there's 27 separate writings in the New Testament. And just like is the case for the Hebrew Bible, we used to make confirmation students memorize all of these in order. But really, again, this is the table of contents, and I'm not sure it does a whole lot of good just to know what the table of contents is. Within the New Testament, there's these groups of writings. There's Gospels, there's history, there's Paul's letters, then there's these letters by these other important people, and then there's the Apocalypse of St. John. But really, this doesn't tell us what's inside the New Testament. So I want to think of it in a little different ways than just a list of the table of contents. What is the New Testament all about? The best way to make sense of this is to compare it to another important document in our society, and that is the Constitution of the United States. Now, the Constitution of the United States was drafted from 1787 to 1789, and it forms the foundational document for our society as a whole. And in this way, there is a lot in common with the New Testament, because the New Testament, which was also drafted by these early founders of the Christian movement, this New Testament serves as the foundational document for the Christian faith. Look at some of the similarities. Both documents contain the governing ideas for their later development. So the governing ideas in the Constitution are about representative government and all the legislative and judicial branch and whatnot. In the New Testament, it's the idea of Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ means to those people who will eventually worship him. Then you have the fact that it's written by the founding fathers. This is the case for the Constitution, and it's certainly the case for the New Testament as well. The 12 disciples and a few people just right outside of them are the writers of the New Testament. Now, there is some speculation that some of these things are edited or reviewed or tweaked later on, and that's fine, but the idea is that there is this founding father connection to the New Testament. Also, it requires ratification. The Constitution had to be ratified by the 13 colonies, and likewise, the New Testament had to be ratified over a much longer period of time, but it had to be ratified by all these Christian communities to agree what 27 pieces of literature should actually be in the New Testament. So it requires ratification, it requires some thought, some communication to make this happen. On top of that, both of them are subject to continued interpretation. Constitutional law is an important part of the law, and we have a Supreme Court that is constantly thinking about how the Constitution relates to everyday activities. The same thing is true for the New Testament. We continue to interpret it to try to make sense, not just of what it is saying, but what it is saying to us. And this is what gives it its ongoing life, which is the last point, which is that both of these are living documents. The Constitution still has a huge role to play in our society, and the same thing is true for the New Testament. It is a living document about the identity of Christianity as a religion. So, the New Testament is really the constitution of the Christian church. All right. So what's inside of it? Well, if you break it down into a pie chart, it turns out that about half of the New Testament is the Gospels. Now, Gospel is another name for good news. It's the message of Jesus. And so the Gospels, there are 4 of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels tell the history of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. That's all they do. So half of the New Testament is just the history of Jesus. That's how fundamental and important Jesus' life is to it. A third of it, which is in that orange little section of the pie, a third of it are letters. These are letters that are written by St. Paul and others to all the communities explaining what the meaning of Jesus is. And so these letters tie back to the Gospels. It's very much focused on what does Jesus mean to us? And so we still see, again, there's a similar theme to all of it. Jesus is at the heart of everything. For the history can be tied very closely to the Gospels. In fact, it's really just an extension of Luke. It's the Acts of the Apostles, these primarily just Paul and Peter. And then there's the Apocalypse. Now, this is the outlier. This is the one that doesn't seem to fit within the rest of the theme. But the Apocalypse focuses on the return of Christ, or Christ overcoming and destroying the Roman Empire. That was a great hoped-for thing at the time, and so it is written in this very strange way. It looks like a futuristic kind of book. I think it's really written about the first century. It's not supposed to be interpreted by later Christians as being somehow predictive of forthcoming events. It doesn't really work like that. We've tried it hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's never panned out quite right. So I don't think Apocalypse is supposed to do that for us. What it's supposed to do is point out, hey, look, what has happened in the Roman Empire will repeat itself over and over, and be mindful of the fact that Christ is still present, Christ is still alive, Christ is still participating in the day-to-day life of people, and so it still has value and meaning. I think that's what the Apocalypse is all about. But you can see that this whole book points toward this whole New Testament points to one single theme, and that theme is, yes, Jesus, right? It's the history of his life, and it's telling us what his life means and how the church is supposed to react and be created and center itself around the life of Christ. Everything is supposed to center around Jesus, and not just Jesus per se as this human guy who's super nice, but Jesus on the cross, Jesus dying. In fact, the Gospels are very heavily focused on the death of Jesus, just as all the letters, and indeed even the Apocalypse, is focused upon Jesus, the one who has died for us. So there is this focus. The New Testament is consistently focused on Jesus, and Jesus in particular on the cross. All of this would say that I think at the very heart of the New Testament lies a very simple phrase. In the Gospels, we find out that Jesus dies. Yes, he lives. Yes, he has this great teaching ministry. He tells parables and wonderful stories, but mostly it's about Jesus dying. The rest of the New Testament, it is focused on what this means for us. And so what we find the theme to be for the entire New Testament is that Jesus dies for us, and the point of it then is to explore what this continues to mean for us, how we should go about living our lives, what the church ought to be, and the whole thing grows out of this one single theme that is dominant throughout the New Testament: Jesus dies for us. That is the whole point of the New Testament teaching. And indeed, this is why we think of it as the constitution for the Christian church. It is very simple, it's very focused, and it achieves for us what the Constitution achieves for the entire United States, which is to serve as the fundamental document that guides not only the development of the Christian church, but all that we as individuals will be able to make sense of and believe as part of the Christian tradition.